us, and we'll get underway soon. We are really excited to have a number of leaders from across the state here today to talk to us about all things Beavers. We're just letting everyone who has registered to tune into this discussion to be able to join us, and we'll start momentarily. Well, thank you for joining us today, and welcome to our Secretary Speaker Series, where we bring big ideas and transformational leaders into public dialogue. My name is Wade Crofin, and I serve as our California Natural Resources Secretary, and I get to lead an agency that is on a mission to steward our natural environment, as well as our important cultural and historic places. I talk about our work as helping people and nature thrive together. And so I am really excited for today's conversation, which is frankly a long time in coming. And of course, it's all about beavers. But I actually need to start with a confession, which is growing up, I took beavers for granted. I spent my first 18 years in the northern Midwest, and I spent a lot of those summers actually living on a lake whose lake level was regulated by beavers. I led backcountry trips for a YMCA camp where one rite of passage was that alarming thwack of the beaver tail if you were canoeing too close to the beaver dam. And it wasn't until years into living in California, I realized that beavers have a very different history in the American West and in California, and some real challenges. And so today, we are excited to unpack the arc of history on beavers in California and discuss some really exciting changes to beaver management in California, thanks to our fish and wildlife leaders we'll be talking to today. As we jump into the discussion, just a few notes to help improve your participation, your tuning in to this discussion. First of all, please enable the chat function on your screen. My colleague Geeta Chandra will be providing links with background on our speakers and then also informational resources that come up in conversation. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So at any point during the discussion, if you want to lob a question or an observation into the panelists, please do so. And we'll work to integrate that into the group conversation that's going to take place toward the end of the discussion. Or our panelists will try to answer your questions directly via the chat function. And then lastly, know that this discussion is being recorded. So if one of our panelists is saying fascinating stuff and you're worried about taking notes, do not worry. The recording of this will be available on our resources webpage just a day or two after the discussion. So we have a number of remarkable speakers here today. We're going to talk to an award-winning conservation journalist and author, a key tribal leader driving changes to beaver management, one of the grassroots leaders that has driven this paradigm shift. We're going to bring in an important federal scientist to help us understand just how beavers figure into our ecosystems. And then we're going to bring in Director Chuck Bonham, who leads our Fish and Wildlife Department in California, and then Valerie Cook, who is now leading all of the work we're doing to change our beaver management in the state. So it should be a great hour. So let's jump in and start by introducing Ben Goldfarb and bring him onto screen. Ben, how are you doing?
Good. How are you, Wade?
Excellent. Well, listen, you are the guy that actually wrote the book, or unimportant book, on beavers called Eager: The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter. And so I wanted you to start off the conversation today with one, explaining how you found yourself writing a book on beavers, but also build context for us about why are beavers important and why are they important in California and the West. Given that we have some, so-called beaver believers here that have been working on these issues for a very long time, but we're joined by several hundred people, a lot of people that may be scratching their heads and trying to understand what's so special about beavers, particularly in this moment in time. So help us understand why beavers.
Yeah, well, thanks for that introduction, Wade, and for having me. I think that any discussion of the beaver story has to begin with how mind-blowingly abundant these animals once were. Today we're probably at 10 to 15 million beavers in North America, which sounds like a lot until you consider that there were as many as 400 million beavers on this continent at the time of European arrival. Beavers, as we all know, build dams and in the process create ponds and wetlands. And the historic footprint of their ponds and wetlands is almost hard to comprehend. Beavers may have impounded enough water at one time to submerge an area the size of Arizona and Nevada put together. And the historical record is full of observations from early trappers and explorers and railroad surveyors documenting spectacular pond and wetland complexes in places that are essentially deserts today. And it's worth noting that many native tribes, like the Blackfeet in Montana, sanctified beavers for their role in creating watering holes for big game in the arid West. So the notion of being a beaver believer isn't remotely new to Western science and this particular historical moment. So, if we used to have 400 million beavers and today we've got 10 or 15, where did they all go? Well, of course, they were trapped for the industrial fur trade, which turned them into hats. The overland fur trade begins in New England in the early 1600s and reaches the American West by the early 1800s. And by the mid-19th century, beavers were functionally extinct in the lower 48. And the consequences of that functional extinction were profound and, again, hard to grasp. Millions of acres of beaver ponds were drained. Streams suffered catastrophic erosion and incision without beaver dams slowing their flows. Rivers disconnected from their floodplains. Lush wetlands dried up. One measure of what a disaster this was is that in some watersheds, coho salmon lost 97% of their winter rearing habitat, thanks in part to beaver trapping. We don't think about the industrial fur trade as the same terms as deforestation in New England or the busting of the Midwestern prairie or gold mining in the Sierra Nevada. But, there's no question this was a seminal ecological catastrophe that permanently shaped North American landscapes. Now, the industrial fur trade was kind of a national disaster or a continent-wide disaster, but it has a kind of a special and distinct history in California. Before the overland trappers, crossing the Sierras reached California, the state's beavers had already largely been plundered by Russian, British, American, and Spanish fur traders operating along the coast. So by the time the overland guys arrived on foot, California had already lost its beavers, which led trappers and eventually biologists to conclude that beavers had never been present in much of the state, including in places like the Bay Area and the High Sierra. The historical record has since been corrected, including by people on this call like Kate Lundquist and many other folks. But that fallacy that beavers don't belong in much of California, or at least didn't belong, I think casts a long shadow. And it's ironic, of course, because few states need beavers more than California, right? Beavers are a keystone species which create habitat for all kinds of other critters. In the American West, wetlands comprise about 2% of land area, but support 80% of biodiversity. So any animal capable of creating wetlands is obviously a very important one. There's, a vast body of scientific literature linking beavers to waterfowl, amphibians, songbirds, other mammals, even insects. In particular interest in California are salmon. Again, many studies showing that beavers improve juvenile salmon rearing habitat, especially for coho salmon. And in addition to being good for other critters, beavers, of course, are good for us. They provide this wonderful litany of ecosystem services. They're agents of water storage and drought mitigation, right? They're keeping water on the landscape by building lots of little reservoirs as the climate gets hotter and hotter and drier. They're buffering floods by capturing runoff from heavy rainfall events in their ponds and wetlands. Certainly could have used some beavers in California this past winter. They're recharging groundwater by spreading water onto floodplains and letting it soak into aquifers. They're capturing nitrogen and phosphorus runoff in the sediments entrained in their ponds. And they're fighting wildfires by spreading water across the landscape and hydrating plants and creating fire breaks. The ecosystem services of beaver reintroduction have been estimated in the tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars in individual river basins, let alone an entire state the size of California. So to sum it up, beavers are good, both for biodiversity and humans. They were largely responsible for shaping North American ecosystems prior to European arrival. The fur trade was this profound ecological disaster, and we're still fighting its legacy today as we try to restore this animal to its former domain. Thanks a lot.
Wade, you're currently muted. Sorry.
Sorry about that. That was a masterclass historical overview of the arc of history on beavers in California. We're going to unpack a lot of that, including just how consequential beavers are beyond their ponds to their environment, to the broad environment, and even our water management strategy across the state. So, Ben, thank you for setting up that context, and look forward to bringing you into the group conversation. I next want to introduce Kenneth McDarmont. Kenneth serves as a council member of the Tule River tribe in our Central Valley. We are on a mission in state government to right historic wrongs, one of which is disconnecting ourselves from Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous environmental leadership. And I'm so thankful that the Tule River tribe has been leading this effort to reintroduce beaver where they've been extirpated in the past. So, council member, huge thanks for your leadership to date. I love your background, by the way. If you could talk about the role of beaver in your nation's history to your people, and what you're doing right now on this topic.
Okay, we'll start with the tribe's history of the beaver. We have the beaver within our pictographs here on the Tule River Indian Reservation. Our pictograph paintings go back from anywhere from 500 to 1,000 years. Some say even older, because we got paintings on top of paintings. So that's where we get our history from the beaver being here. And then talking to elders that we still have on the reservation, they talk about the beaver within the different locations of the reservation when they was kids. At this point, we don't have no beaver that live here now. But our beaver culture and history goes back a long way within history. So back in 2014 is when this struggle started, and one of California's worst droughts. And of course, we know the climate change droughts in California, they've been nonstop for the last 20 years or so. So that's when we thought about it. So, the beaver was here. Let's bring them back, and let's let the beaver do what they do naturally to bring back and cure our problems within our watershed. With bringing the beaver home, we'll revitalize the whole watershed within all the creeks and tributaries to the main stream of the Tule River. So that's the whole point, is to bring home a keystone species to the Tule River, and would love to bring them to everywhere within California also.
Wow, that's remarkable. So you have these pictographs that demonstrate clearly beaver were a critical part of the watershed and your people's history, and then that history of even elders alive today. So talk about the effort since 2014 and where you're at. Have there been barriers to trying to get beaver back, and what's been your effort?
Yes, 2014 is when we started this campaign, looking at any way possible to how do we get beaver here on the Tule River Indian Reservation. And that's when we met OAC, Kate and Brock and Kevin Swiftwater Design. That's when we started a relationship there. Moving forward, we been working with them all these years, and in 2020 with their assistance, and actually we got a whole beaver all our supporters that are helping us with this grant that we received, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife grant in 2020 with the assistance of OAC, Swiftwater Design, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, California Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Forest Service, and Tulalip Tribes of Washington. So we received this grant within 2020. We're trying to move forward, trying to move beaver, but it's still not legal to move beaver within California at this time. So luckily last year with the governor's new proposal, it made all that possible. So now moving forward with the state representatives to help on these projects. Hopefully this year we'll have a couple successful relocation projects to move forward. And with these projects, we're going to take away from the fish and game depredation permits, and we're going to give these beaver a chance to do what they do naturally in a place where they're wanted.
That is so exciting. And we've talked about, our hope that the first, relocation or trans-relocation of a beaver, moving a beaver into a watershed where it no longer exists, we hope it will be a tribally led relocation. And so we're going to unpack that a little bit later with our colleagues from the Department of Fish and Wildlife. So thanks so much, Council Member. You referenced Kate Lundquist, and Kate leads the Occidental Arts and Ecology Center Water Institute. And I think in a universe of beaver believers, Kate, you and your colleagues were very early on this. And I think, I'll just be honest, I think we're here, frankly, because of the efforts of you and so many others that saw the potential, saw the mistakes we made in history, and really advocated, urged, held us accountable at the state and federal level for changing policy to expand, beaver habitat. So talk about, the little bit of your history, your organization's history, how long you've been working on this, what was sort of the pathway to where we are today, and then talk a little bit about the work that you're doing.
Well, thanks so much for having us here. And yeah, so I've been working with my co-director, Brock Dolman, for the last 20 years, actually, building the capacity of watershed to employ innovative nature-based solutions to restore their watersheds and recover imperiled species and build resiliency to climate change. And early on, we became aware of the potential for beaver restoration within that, and had been noticing a lot of the successes from our out-of-state colleagues and partners, what they were doing to really help restore their listed species as well, and having a whole bunch of successes outside of California. And we realized that this would be really wonderful to start implementing here at home to recover a bunch of our species. And in particular, coho salmon for us was a super critical species that had been demonstrated to really benefit from the effects of having beaver in their systems. And so we wanted to bring beaver back to California so that we could restore our salmon. And we did come up against some resistance. As Ben mentioned, initially there were some confusing misperceptions around where beaver are native to. And thankfully, the work that we were able to do with a group of us to gather and publish the evidence that indicates that beaver were in fact native to much of the state has really helped change that narrative. And yet there was still resistance and challenges that we were coming up against. And so we launched 10 years ago, launched our Bring Back the Beaver campaign. And, we were really just trying to help educate and demonstrate how beaver can help private and public landowners meet their resource management goals through coexistence, through beaver habitat enhancement, even partnering with the beaver to expand their habitat, mimic them in places where beaver were not returned yet, and when coexistence measures had failed or been exhausted, to employ relocation as a technique. So since then, we've been working with an amazing group of partners to implement and showcase all of these forms of beaver restoration and ensure that our state policy does the same. And it's just been an amazing ride for the last 10 years of hundreds of talks and conference sessions and site visits and grant proposals and collaborative restoration projects and field tours, bringing the people out to see the benefits for themselves, public meetings, brown bag presentations, private consultations, lots of educational materials and whatnot. And we have been able to help build with a bunch of other folks in California this amazing momentum that really uplifts the value of beaver as a conservation partner. And so finally, we've also really leveraged that we've got these amazing restoration communities that are working in our headwaters, in the mountain meadows, and in our riparian rangelands, in the foothills, and our salmon streams to really empower them to employ beaver restoration as a tool as well, and really help highlight the potential and benefits that can bring to all of our ecosystems really here in California. And so ultimately, to find ourselves here today, where we're in this moment of this beaver restoration program being funded and stood up on its feet, and that beaver restoration, management plan is going to be created with a lot of our input, is truly gratifying to be here at this moment. And we're aware that the real work has just begun now. Ultimately, we've got our work cut out for us, and we really would love to see that we can create this program and plan that's nimble and accessible enough to support meaningful beaver restoration at the pace and scale that's really needed to meet the challenges that are being brought on by climate change. So we're ready and we're excited, and just so grateful to be here with this great crew of folks that's working on this amazing project.
Well, thank you and so many others for fighting the good fight for a durable campaign over 2 decades to shift the paradigm on beavers. And I'm really proud of the progress that we'll talk about here today, but of course, a lot of work ahead. So it's really important to remember that. I will say, if you can, come close to the camera. That is a beaver on your hat with the California flag, is it not? California
sure
Republic of the Beaver. Amazing.
That's right.
And then what background is of that? Is that in California?
This is up in Carson Pass. This is Foresta Creek. And yeah, it's a beautiful beaver wetland managed all by the beaver themselves, keeping that water up on our landscape long into the dry season.
Wow, incredible. Thank you, Kate. Look forward to looping back when we're talking as a group. I next want to introduce an important scientist, a research ecologist from our U.S. Department of Agriculture Forest Service, U.S. Forest Service, Dr. Karen Pope. Karen, Dr. Pope, welcome to this discussion.
Thanks much.
Yeah,
I'm one of those people Kate lured in.
Yeah, so talk about a little bit about your journey on this, and then I think really want you to help distill, from a scientist perspective and a federal agency perspective, the role that you think beavers can play in our environment and our ecosystems.
Yeah, great. So I think one important thing to remember is that our headwaters, whether it's the Sierra Nevada, the Klamath, the Southern Cascades, have been greatly altered. And that alteration has been directional. We have been moving water out of the mountains faster than nature, whether it's because of the beaver or because of draining and ditching for livestock, mining. And so we are starting to make that change where we're realizing that with climate change and the associated megafires and the associated droughts, that we really need that dispersed ecological water storage in our headwaters. And we have tens of thousands of catchments in the high mountains that need this restoration. So we're taking a two-pronged approach, right? We're doing human restoration in some areas where it seems most reasonable, but super excited about partnering with the original agroforesters, the original dam builders to create that water storage. We just cannot do it without their help. And so yeah, that's basically where our research has headed, and just creating visuals that allow us to see how degraded our headwaters have become, and just the opportunities for restoration in those areas to really capture sediment that's otherwise flowing into our reservoirs, to do a lot of these ecosystem services. And using beaver is absolutely probably the prime tool.
Wow. I think it was Kate's colleague Brock who coined the benefit of beavers as the slow it, spread it, sink it for water. And so you talk about the really restoring that water in the headwaters. I'm interested, given that you work for the Forest Service, just over half of our lands in California are owned and managed by the federal government. We have 18 national forests across our state. Obviously, such tremendous potential to reintroduce beavers or support beavers where it makes sense. Can you just talk about where the Forest Service is at in this journey?
No. However, I will say that there's reduced infrastructure concerns on our public lands. There's plenty of space, and so it is on people's minds, and it is of interest, and the different forest leaders are definitely moving forward with plans. And I think this is an absolute, I totally agree. It's a great opportunity for our public agencies to work with the state and start moving on plans to get beavers back into our public lands.
Yeah. Well, I'm really excited. I mean, we have such good partnerships with the Forest Service on all things related to wildfire resilience and reducing the risks of catastrophic wildfire, restoring the ecological health of our landscapes. And I'm excited to, partner with the Forest Service and make progress together on, reintroduction of beaver where it makes sense, because not only is it a water supply strategy, but of course it's, as you've pointed out, a good strategy to reduce catastrophic wildfire risk. And I know there have been instances across California where beaver have been present and created wet landscape where you have a lot less wildfire damage, right?
Yeah, like Emily Fairfax's work with Smokey the Beaver. Anything that creates a fuel break is a good thing as far as the Forest Service is concerned. So beaver are right up there.
And as a scientist, how would you characterize, the state of science or the community of scientists working on this? Are there big gaps of knowledge? Is there broad consensus, sharp disagreements?
Yeah, I think there's good consensus. I think in California, the science is behind because of the history of beaver in California, and that there was a misconception in science that beaver were not native. And so there's a lot of catch up to do in terms of beaver science. And I do hope that we can all the scientists can work together. We have new issues associated with climate change and different conditions out there. That can beavers stay? Are they just going to get washed out? How do they deal with non-native species and aquatic diseases? So we have a lot of science that is pointing us that it's a positive, but in California we still have work to do, especially in like Southern California, where we have a lot of non-native species and a lot of threatened and endangered species. So, but it's going to be places where we can really move, and then places where we need to really slow down. But as we move forward, I think it will be very important to collect data and see what's going on, and really show where it works well and move fast in those places. Wow.
Thank you, Karen, for that. And interesting, learning for me in this conversation is that for so long, it sounds like science or some scientists did not recognize beavers as being native to California. So fascinating. That's why I love these conversations. I learn something new in every one. I want to shift to talking about where we're at in state government. We've talked about the history of beavers in the American West, and specifically in California, some of the challenges or policies that prevented beavers from doing what they do to support their ecosystems. And the exciting part about this conversation is we've made a paradigm shift. And the person in state government leading that paradigm shift is Chuck Bonham. And I want to bring Chuck onto the screen. Chuck leads our Department of Fish and Wildlife. And Chuck, you have really been one of my key educators on all things beaver, and you have driven what is a really exciting set of changes in our state policy. So if you would, share personally, how you came to this, what your reflections are on the conversations that have taken place, and then also start to talk about what we're now starting to do.
Wade, thank you for creating the venue. And there's a couple things I'd like to do in a few short minutes. I have been very contemplative and reflective recently, and I wanted to share some thoughts that are almost philosophical about this topic. I want to share my experience around change, and then I want to end with a quick show and tell, which has a personal meaning for me. So I've been thinking a lot about my time as director and all that I've seen happen in California. And everywhere you look has been some form of change. And an example I thought about this morning on my way into the office was most of the folks that are watching may not know that maybe 7 years ago, we actually changed our name from the California Department of Fish and Game to the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. Game changed to wildlife. And I think for some in California, that was too much change. And for others in California, it was not enough change. And so what is change? And it turns out there's this dynamic that comes out of the emotional kind of how do you handle grief and loss? And there's a Swiss American psychiatrist. She created something called the Kubler-Ross change curve in 1969. And it's this dynamic that tracks a person's emotional journey through grief and experience and denial and anger. But that work has eventually moved into the world of management. And of course, in the management world, it's been converted to metrics and monitoring. But most people will tell you, you can do all the process in the world, you can create all the systems in the world, but change doesn't really happen until you understand what's going on with people themselves. And that transition really happens when the person becomes able to adapt and the person stops focusing on what feels like being lost and instead begins to look to explore what happens in the future from the change. And we can see these things at our department, maybe as a petri dish for California as we think about our past and we look to our future. And our relationships with our tribal leaders is an example. I mean, when I was in law school, I spent a lot of time researching and writing journal articles. And we applaud the Marshall Court as this amazing Supreme Court, but it's that court that created something called the doctrine of discovery, which is this idea that to the conqueror went the spoils. It's the legal theory that allowed civilization exploring West to take lands from tribes. And that's the predicate that has been the underpinning of the injustice our society and tribal sovereigns have experienced since. And we're changing in that space. And I think Beavers help show that change. But there's another dynamic for our department where in California and around the West, we used to view and label certain animals as vermin, as nuisance. And we trapped and we shot them off the landscape. So today, it turns out we have wolves back in California after about 100 years. A couple of weeks ago, many of y'all saw we have our second confirmed wolverine sighting in California. They've been gone for almost 100 years. Because of our Fish and Game Commission, we no longer allow contests to shoot coyotes off the landscape. We have changed policies on how we manage human-wildlife conflict around bears, around mountain lions. I spent a lot of time in our rural communities and with our tribal leaders. For some, this change is too fast, and for others, it's too slow. But I'm super proud of Valerie Cook, of you, Wade, of the governor, of all y'all that are participating right now, our leaders in the tribal space. We are moving to a different future. It's not a sin to feel pride about being able to adapt to change. You come to that with humility. And Let me end with my show and tell. So let me set this in the 1940s and 50s. In the late 40s, we had the invention of Tupperware and Velcro and the Frisbee, which are fantastic inventions. And in 1950, the Korean War started. James Dean got his first break in a Pepsi commercial. I know because I got Wikipedia up on my laptop here. And the first credit card came out and it was cardboard. But also, I happen to have the original on my wall in my office. And this is a page from Outdoor California, back when we were called the Division of Fish and Game. And it dates to 1950. I think Brock and others use it in their materials. And I'll read what it says. It says, California's busy beavers are being transplanted, sometimes by parachute, to mountain areas where their industry and skill will benefit the state. These beavers are live trapped by the Department of Fish and Game in farm areas where they can damage crops and levees. Beaver dams in the mountains save water for fish, wildlife, and agriculture. We did that in 1950. Now, fast forward to 2023, this year, because of Valerie, the governor's investment, Kenneth, others, we're going to relocate beavers to the Tule River tribe. We're going to do the same with the Maidut Summit in the Sierras. And we now have a policy that fosters moving animals from one watershed where they may be causing challenges to another where they can produce those kind of benefits known back in 1950 by our department. So if I could, let me introduce Valerie Cook. I'll get out of the way. Valerie is the one that's our future. Valerie, tell us what we're doing on the ground right now for beavers.
Great. Thanks, Chuck. Happy to be here. This is a great panel. This panel and all that you've heard so far today are really why I'm sitting here and why we're able to have this conversation. So I'm really happy to be a part of it. So as Chuck mentioned, in support of the state's commitment to nature-based solutions, the department received funding and positions to establish CDFW's new beaver restoration program. And as of March, we now have 5 fully dedicated scientists actively building this program to restore beavers on the landscape and facilitate restoration of the ecosystems for a wide variety of ecological objectives. And though we only have a team of 5 or 6, including me, we are immersed in collaboration throughout our department, including with our inland and our anadromous fisheries programs, our regional wildlife and fisheries units, and our wildlife and fisheries health labs. Beyond those internal collaborations, though, we're also working very closely with a technical advisory group that includes both of our panelists, Kate Lundquist and Karen Pope, but also includes representatives from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Forest Service, the National Marine Fisheries Service, the Yurok Tribe, the Scott River Watershed Council, the Nature Conservancy, and academia, including Dr. Emily Fairfax and the team at Utah State University. So effectively, all of the advocates that got us here to this point and the pioneers that have been paving the way for the last decade or so. So this group of seasoned experts really is here and going to ensure that we are on track and best equipped to build this program out most effectively and relatively quickly. So in terms of the program and our operations, there are really 4 main facets of the program that I'll mention today. And so that's promoting human beaver coexistence, outreach and education, conducting translocations, and developing a beaver management and restoration plan. So our initial steps in the coexistence and outreach education space are reflected in the recent release of the department's new beaver depredation policy, which really represents a shift towards more effective promotion of human beaver coexistence through non-lethal damage deterrent techniques. So fundamentally, that policy shift, it guides our internal procedures to improve situational awareness of beaver damage complaints, aid our staff in identifying where conflicts can be reasonably resolved with non-lethal means, and ensures that our staff are best equipped with the knowledge to effectively advise landowners of these options and provide stakeholders with the information and the resources necessary for implementation and successful coexistence with beavers. The other two facets of the program, conducting translocations and development of the management plan, are perhaps really the more intriguing part of what's on the horizon and what we're talking about today. We have started working on our first two pilot projects with the Maidu Summit Consortium on Tasman-Koyam, and then also with the Tule River Tribe on their reservation. And I do want to note that, yeah, Kenneth has been really the driving force behind that project, and really a great partner in helping us move this forward. These projects are critical because this is really where we're building and refining our procedures, learning where we need to adapt to move forward, and will be where we ultimately finalize our process for evaluating, implementing, and analyzing the results of our translocation projects to ensure that we're reporting out in meaningful ways into the broadest group of interested Californians. Ultimately, these projects are the building blocks for us to start scaling up our operations next year so that we can fulfill more project requests and start evaluating department-led collaborative projects in watersheds of interest for the habitats and the species under CDFW's purview. And lastly, in collaboration with the technical advisory group that I mentioned, we're initiating development of the Beaver Management and Restoration Plan, which is really where we'll define our program procedures, justify our decisions, and guide how we prioritize sites, projects, and watersheds, as well as how we prioritize our work with the tribes in California. But ultimately, I'm really extremely excited about this program and its potential, because I really see this program as a unique opportunity for the department to take on a more active role in the restoration and conservation of California's ecosystems and building resiliency to the effects of climate change. So I'm really, that's an exciting space for the department to be in, and kind of a shift from the regulatory and permitting space, and really being able to play that more active role and move things forward here in California.
Valerie and Chuck, that is really, really exciting progress. I'll note that Geeta put in the chat a link. If anyone listening in today wants to get more engaged in the development of the Beaver Management Plan, there's a website where you can add your email and get on the subscriber list so that you can figure in. I hear often that too often in government, our decision-making, our program creation can feel like a black box, a little bit opaque to people. So I'm glad, Valerie, that you and your 5-person team are leaning forward on consulting the experts, be they the scientific experts, the community leaders that have been leading on this, obviously tribal leaders as well. I want to bring us into a group conversation all together, and we've got some great questions coming in from participants here today, and please keep them coming. As I shared in the beginning of our discussion, if you have a question or an observation that you'd like answered or to figure into the conversation, please put it in the Q&A box and I'll work to integrate that. We're also asking our panelists to type answers to some direct questions wherever possible. One question I have in my mind is, clearly beavers are so important in a lot of places, but they do have impacts in some settings, whether it's certain agricultural irrigation settings or to water agencies. And so, Chuck and Valerie, I'm interested in how this shift has been perceived by some of the infrastructure managers that might, typically have concerns about how beavers impact their operations.
Let me start and then flip it to Valerie and just say, our June 2023 policy update keeps a clear provision that when someone interfaces with us because of a property damage that creates this public health and safety kind of critical infrastructure issue, we're able to work on that in an expeditious way. We acknowledge that may be the fastest pathway where we will be issuing a permit for lethal take. So we understand that and put it into the policy. I think in the rural landscape, my experience is we have both dynamics going on. Many landowners, many communities, ranchers can see the benefit from beavers, like in the photo behind Kate. But this is change, and change relates to people, and change is challenging. And for other parts of our communities, the change we're bringing them, wolves, bears, lions, beavers, is hard. And we need to appreciate that and be willing to work through it. So the department's having both experiences, but we know what our future is, which is beavers in a different role. Valerie, I don't know if you have anything to add or correct.
No, I think, the only thing I would add to that is I think there is in some spaces a misperception and belief that the department is just going to cease issuing depredation permits. And I think the reality is that we're just being more conscientious about how and where and when those are issued, and just making sure that we're issuing permits where they're warranted and justified, and where they're not, we're steering people to those non-lethal options and promoting the coexistence. So it is really that tiered approach that we're taking that follows the path we've taken with bears and mountain lions, and making sure that what we're doing is warranted and justified.
That's great. Thank you. Getting some questions in around beavers and flood protection. We talk a lot about beavers and sort of water supply by slowing down the water that allows for the slow trickle of water through streams throughout the season. Does anybody want to speak to the role that beavers can play reducing downstream flood risks?
I'm happy to chime in.
Please.
And thanks for your, I also just want to say that we have amazing coexistence strategies out there, and lots of information available. And that's so great that the department is going to be providing that technical assistance and support in that regard. And sure, so think of beavers like to build complexes and have lots of dams. You can see in the picture behind me, the main dam, and then there's several dams downstream. And those dams end up helping slow that flow down and shunt it out onto the floodplain. They act like speed bumps. And so when you get these sudden runoff events, the water has a place to go, and it doesn't just go coursing straight in a straight line like a lot of our waterways have become, which can become really damaging to our watersheds. And so this is where Beaver can really shine in having lots of multiple dams to help take the energy out of that high flows, and put it off in broader parts of our landscape, and really make a difference.
So in winters like this winter where we had so much snow, had we had a really warm spring, that would have had an alarming amount of runoff in one time. Those beaver dams, those beaver complexes slow that snow melt from entering in at one time, right? And allow for more of a slow, steady movement of water down the rivers.
Exactly. Yeah, and having lots of dispersed dams throughout the system in the smaller tributaries really helps. And Karen, did you want to add something to that?
I just want to add the flip side is during drought, when base flow is really important. That holding of water back allows for actual water in the streams. So it can be really important for our fish and our amphibians and our aquatic species downstream. It's not just the habitat on site of the beaver dams behind the beaver dams. It's also the stream channel below. It cools the water and adds that groundwater connectivity that allows for summer flows when the rains aren't coming.
Yeah, it's incredible. Just the multiple benefits that it provides. A lot of questions coming in about translocation, and I think there's a lot of interest among those tuning in on. Greg asked the question, is there a process for requesting beaver relocation to one's watershed or large ranch property? Sarah asked, can someone be sued for locating beavers themselves? So given all this interest and the fact that you're just beginning to pilot what this modern era of translocation can look like, Valerie, Chuck, what would you say to this great interest around how people can understand how translocation will work?
I won't give out my cell phone number as the way to request translocation. I will point people to Valerie because that's exactly what we're engaged in right now, using the advisory leaders here and the public. What is a structured decision-making process? And then lastly, look, I appreciate the could you be sued? I'm a good Samaritan. We're a litigious society, but I think that speaks to the rigor in which we'll do the due diligence on making these decisions and moving the animals around. Valerie, how are we going to let people understand the process and to know where to put a request in?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, these pilot projects are where we are building out the process. For a translocation to occur, every translocation effort into a site requires an approved translocation plan. And that is where we do our due diligence in evaluating the suitability for the animals that are going to be released there, potential risks with human-wildlife conflict, risks to infrastructure, and unintended impacts to other species in the area. For example, what's the risk that we exacerbate whirling disease in a trout stream? These are all factors that we have to evaluate and do our due diligence in ensuring that what we're doing is responsible and the outcomes will be positive. And if there are risks, that we know how to mitigate those before we move forward. So that's the process that we're building out right now. We're building it through these pilots. And when we have that finalized later this year through this process, we will then open up and create a request mechanism, requesting the appropriate levels of information that we need to be able to begin evaluations of those projects moving forward. So we're building the process. We will create online through our website the request mechanism through which those can be requested, and very clearly lay out what kinds of information we're going to need in order to receive those and move them forward.
That's great, Valerie. So I'd characterize that as we want to move as quickly as possible. We want to get it right, and we want to create a durable and sustainable program on translocation. There's a question for Kenneth from Jonathan, and just asking you, Kenneth, how the reintroduction of beaver may fit into the tribe's vision and efforts on larger meadow restoration or larger sort of restoration of your watershed.
With the reintroduction of the beaver comes the meadow restoration projects that the tribe's already been working on in the past few years with the OAC and Kevin Swift from Swiftwater Design. We have the high altitude meadows right about 6,500 elevation right now. We've been unable to get up to one of the meadows that we did one of these projects on this past summer, but the other one that we did do some of the work on, you can see where the slow runoff from the diversions that we put in there slowed the water down, spread it out, and these meadows are actually spreading out and coming back to life where they was getting drier over the past years. So we do have meadow restoration projects to go with the bringing back the beaver. So it's all projects that work together to get what we want, which is to revitalize our watershed and our streams.
Yeah, thank you, Kenneth. And I've learned so much about the importance of mountain meadows that we see when we drive around the Sierra Nevada, and beavers are obviously so important in that. We have just a little bit of time left, and I wanted to do a round robin. We've covered a lot here today, a lot about the past, a lot about the present, and I want to look to the future. And I want to ask each of you, what are your hopes for California and beaver in the next decade or two? What does success look like if we, transport ourselves to 2040, 17 years from now? What are we going to see across California if we're successful? And I'll start out with Ben. Ben, you have been so helpful in building just broad awareness around the role that beavers can play. What are your thoughts on the future?
Yeah, I think that both Chuck and Valerie talked about beaver coexistence, using non-lethal tools to deal with conflicts when they inevitably arise. And I guess I would love to see an expansion of those approaches, not only in California, but really around the country. It's been interesting to sort of watch the trajectory of beaver restoration. I think that when I started working on the book, 7 or 8 years ago, the focus was very much on beaver relocation. Beavers cause a problem. Let's move the beaver to another habitat where, it'll do some good and get away from people. And I think that increasingly beaver conservationists and biologists and sort of coexistence projects are focused on solving problems where they occur. Let's just not kill these animals. That's kind of the beautiful thing about beavers, is that they're rodents, they reproduce quickly, they create their own habitat, they're really good at they disperse widely, so they're good at colonizing new areas, and if we just don't kill them, they're actually pretty good at restoring themselves for us. So I would love to see an expansion of coexistence tools and really having that kind of non-lethal coexistence be the default rather than lethal removal being the default, as it is not only in California but in basically every state in the country at this moment.
Thank you for that, Ben. So important. And we're certainly moving in that direction. Karen, thoughts? What does the future look like if we get it right?
Yeah, I have to resort to our good friend Brock Dolman from Occidental Arts and Ecology Center because he's so good at the one-liners. I would really like to see us move out of the drainage, so to speak, and back to ecological storage in our mountains especially, and really integrate restoration at a landscape scale so that the aquatic component that is so vastly important gets considered when we're doing forest work and upland work, and so that there's an aquatic component and wildfire work and fuels reduction in all of it.
That's remarkable. Kenneth, I know success for collective success in coming months means getting actually beaver onto your tribal lands. But what does it look like in 10 years if you're successful and we're successful together?
Being successful together will be spreading that water out, keeping it here on the ground longer. The meadows are going to grow. They're going to let out more and more water throughout the summer months. It's going to create those buffer zones for the wildfires, which we have in California, which have affected the rest so much in the past years. I mean, it's just good all around for everybody, even the downstream users with that water coming slow throughout the year. It's just a benefit to all within our watershed.
Wow. Well, huge thanks for all you have done and are doing. Kate, you've been at it 20 years. What can California look like 10 years from now?
Oh, so beautiful. So that we have a California where all landowners have technical and financial assistance to implement coexistence, beaver coexistence, and other forms of beaver restoration, and that our management plan is so forward-thinking and progressive and not too complex that it doesn't hinder beaver restoration at the landscape scale, and that all of our threatened and endangered species that benefit from beaver, our Sierra Nevada willow flycatcher, our Cascades frogs, our sage grouse, our red-legged frogs, our coho salmon, our Chinook, our steelhead, that they are all thriving in beaver complexes across the state.
I love that vision. Valerie, a lot of hope and expectation resting on the shoulders of 5 people at CDFW. No pressure. I'm kidding, because of course this is a collective effort, but what does success look like to you at the Beaver Restoration Program in coming years?
Yeah, well, I won't speak. I'll leave Chuck to speak on behalf of the department itself, but I'll say for me personally, staff throughout the department, year in and year out, spend so much time identifying these pressures and stressors and the challenges and the impacts to the species and the habitats under our purview. And, this program, we're in a good position now to be a good restoration partner to these external projects, and people like Kate and others throughout the state who are engaged and willing and pursuing these restoration efforts that our department and the species under our purview benefit from. But I really see this program as an opportunity for the department to step into that more active role where we can propose and we can lead these big collaborative landscape or watershed scale restoration efforts for the benefit and the restoration and the conservation of those species and habitats under our purview. So that's the shift that I see, and that's what I see as the potential success here, is the department being able to actively engage in those restoration efforts for the species that we spend all this time identifying the challenges for. So I see a lot of promise, and that's kind of the potentials that I see for success down the road.
So exciting. And of course, taking our lessons learned that sometimes our government programs have been too complex or too hard to understand or access, and creating those partnerships, as Kate said, that are really clear and understandable and can be utilized. Chuck, quite rightly giving you final word here.
2 things. Every sovereign nation that under its own self-determination wants a co-management agreement with our department to do these things has one. Second, all of our sons and daughters, our cousins, our friends that are the next generations behind us, show up in the future. And this isn't a change issue. It's a status quo issue. They don't know anything different because we're making the change now.
Well, thank you all for the work you do, for spending an hour helping educate me and, boy, well over 300 people about the role that beavers can play in California and all the work helping them help us. Greatly appreciate everyone being here today. We'll bring up one final slide as we conclude, and that slide gives you information if you would like to recommend future
It sounds like Wade's audio cut out. So please share any suggestions at this email. Also, thank you for attending.